Good afternoon, and welcome to Public Lectures at the APS. My name is Annie Westcott, and I'm the Society's Director of Meetings. And I don't know about all of you, but I can't get my brain wrapped around that summer's over, and we're already launched on an exciting program of fall talks. We have 3 coming up within the next 19 days. Yes. So our next one is actually this Thursday, September the 20th. So this coming Thursday, and it's our terrific librarian, Patrick Spiro, and he's going to launch his new book called Frontier Rebels, how the fight for independence in the American West, I think West is defined as Pittsburgh in this volume. Now, we have the papers of John Wheeler, the black hole scientist here. However, we do not live in a black hole, so we know that Jill Lepore is speaking at the Free Library this same evening. We know that Ken Burns is at the Museum of the American Revolution this same evening. These are respected, prolific, bold-faced names, and they both happen to be APS members. I, however, want to urge you to forego those opportunities and be here with us to hear Patrick tell his tale of the black-faced boys and their rebellion and how it really sowed the seeds for the conflict between rural and urban that we continue to see today. Patrick Spiro is a rising intellectual star, and you're going to want to hear what he has to say. Now, just 2 weeks after, on Thursday, October the 4th, we have Hannah Holborn Gray with us. Mrs. Gray leads a pretty nifty life. She is an immigrant child from early Hitler's Germany who went on to become the president of the University of Chicago. She has also served on the boards of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and the Smithsonian. So put another way, Mrs. Gray has either directly or indirectly touched all of our lives. Now, as I glance in the balcony, I happen to see that the President Emeritus of Bryn Mawr College is with us, so I had better add that Mrs. Gray is an alum of Bryn Mawr College. You're very welcome, Dr. McPherson. And I think, didn't she serve on your board? Yes, she chaired the Bryn Mawr board. Did I mention that she's led a rather nifty life, has Mrs. Gray? She will be with us in conversation on an academic life, and that's going to be on October the 4th. So that now brings us back to today. So the very first thing that we must do today is turn off your cell phones. Yes, you don't want to be that person, so everybody put their cell phone on mute, please. And of course, our speaker is grabbing her cell phone. This is perfect. So, we are privileged indeed to have with us today Mary Robinson. A barrister by training, Mary Robinson was elected the 7th President of Ireland in 1990, the first woman to hold that position. She would go on to become the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, in 1999, she was elected to the American Philosophical Society. And it's pretty darn hard under the best of circumstances to be elected to the APS, but each year we elect less than 10 international citizens. In 2009, President Robinson received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Barack Obama. On that same occasion, President Obama also recognized Billie Jean King, Sandra Day O'Connor, Desmond Tutu, and Stephen Hawking. Not bad company to be keeping, President Robinson. So today she runs a wonderful foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation, and she also is the UN Special Envoy for Climate Change. So she has led and leads a rich life filled with many titles, but I suspect the title that she enjoys most is grandmother. Yes, much nodding of head going on here in the front row. Today she's with us, and she's not going to talk about climate change. We all know that the climate is changing, and it's changing at an alarming rate. So today she's going to talk about climate justice and how, for the sake of humanity, on a very grassroots level, each of us can commit to take action with inspiration and hope and to face this challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege, Mary Robinson.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and it is really a pleasure to be back here at the American Philosophical Society. I was very honored to be elected as an international member, and then I got another medal you should have mentioned, the Benjamin Franklin Medal. That wasn't mentioned. And then I came when my memoir was published. I was very pleased to come here and speak about the memoir called Everybody Matters. I have a husband with a good sense of humor, and it's in my ear that he used to always confuse it with Everybody Mutters. But and I'm here today to talk about this book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future. And there's a link between the two books, because the editor of Everybody Matters and my agent at the time are here, and I'd like them to out themselves. George and Lynn, George Gibson and Lynn Franklin, there they are. You'll understand in a minute why I'm outing them. I felt that George had been really supportive, not just of the book, but of the promotion of the book here in the United States. And when Lynn Franklin dropped me an email to say that she was retiring as an agent, I happened to be coming with my husband Nick to New York in January 2016. And I said to Lynn, well, let's have a drink for old time's sake, and if George was around, that would be great. So the four of us met in the hotel that Nick and myself were staying in to have this drink. And I remember George asking me, well, how are things? How's your foundation going on climate justice? And I said, well, I'm very proud of the work my foundation is doing. I mean, we're actually, we're making a difference in bringing human rights and gender into the UN official system, and we're working hard. But I'm still frustrated that it's not more of an issue, especially for the women's movement, but generally for people. And I said, I honestly think the only way to make it really an issue for people is to tell stories of those who are coping with the unfairness and the injustice of climate change. And George said, well, Mary, if you will write a storytelling book about climate justice, I will edit it, and I will see that Bloomsbury will publish it. And Lynn said, and I won't retire, I'll stay out of retirement just for that. So I describe it in the acknowledgements as a labor of love, because that's literally how it happened. Now, there was another point, and that was that it was very helpful and indeed necessary for me that when I was writing my memoir, my daughter, Tessa, who was a lawyer who had practiced, but she'd stopped practicing outside the home when her two children arrived and were young. She did copy editing of legal texts, and she had some time. So she helped me with the memoir. And Lynn said, Mary, you're going to need some help with this, and I think I have an ideal person to help you. And the ideal person was Katrina Palmer. And Katrina, I know, and I can't quite see, is here with her daughter Kivna. Stand up, Katrina, please. And Kivna. Kivna's 11. And Lynn sent me Katrina's book about herself, about growing up in Ireland and then realizing she was adopted and tracing her adoptive mother. And, it's a difficult story which she tells beautifully and, has a great writing skill. And we met and we got on, and Katrina didn't really know anything much about climate. This wasn't something she was familiar with. it has changed her life. She's taken it so seriously that now she's cut her emissions, she cycles to work in Washington, what else? I don't know, but anyway, it's had a big impact on her, and that's been fun in a way because, and I'm sure Kivna, an 11-year-old who understands climate justice, is keeping her mother well tuned. So that's how the book was born. And then, you know, how to kind of write this book, how to approach it. And I have met some extraordinary people in my time, both before I set up my foundation in Dublin. I had an organization in New York with colleagues in Aspen, in Washington, D.C., and in Geneva, and it was called Realizing Rights. And we were working on economic and social rights in African countries, rights to food and water, etc. And that's really where I came to understand the impacts of climate change on vulnerable countries. We had a tendency, and there's still a slight tendency, to talk about climate change as if it's a problem of the future. But in these African countries, it wasn't a problem of the future. It was an absolute problem of now. And it was a problem of survival, of food security, of having enough clean water, etc. And one of the ways that I get into the first story is to talk about an experience I had before the Copenhagen conference. That was my first conference in 2009. And I had another hat at the time. I was the honorary president of Oxfam International. And Oxfam were gathering testimonies from those very affected, frontline testimonies about climate change, again to try to promote the idea of how serious it was. And I was asked to be with Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa for a panel and to hear 5 farmers' stories. That was nice for me because I had just, not long before that, become a member of the elders that Nelson Mandela brought together, and our chair was Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So I was delighted to be back in his company. That was fun in itself. And we sat and we listened to these 5 farmers. 4 of them were women, which is the reality and true of farming in Africa and in most of Asia. And the man was a pastoralist from Kenya who had 200 goats and camels, and he was down to his last 20, and he didn't see any future because of prolonged drought in that part of Kenya, just really, really terrible drought, and he looked awful and haggard. There was a rooibos farmer from South Africa, rooibos tea, which I'm sure a number of you have sampled, very good tea, and she explained again it was drought that was affecting the rooibos growing, and so they hadn't produced any practically in that year, and she looked very bad. There was a woman from Mali who spoke about the flooding in her part of Mali, which is a very big country in Africa, as you probably know. One of the saddest was a woman from Malawi who said that things were so bad that a number of women that she knew were becoming prostitutes because they were so desperate. It was sex for survival, as it's called. And then there was this woman who's become a really good friend since then, Constance Okollet, who's from eastern Uganda, and she told her story with great dignity. She's tall. In fact, I was on a panel with her in California. She was at the conference I've just come from in California, the climate conference, and Constance is now quite a voice at these conferences, but when she has something important to say, she stands up. So it's very funny, you'll be on a panel, and then she stands up, and she's tall, and she has that sense of herself and great dignity in her way of speaking. And she described the terrible storm that came to her part of eastern Uganda, her village, in September 2007. And she knew that this was something much, much worse than before. And the houses in the village were destroyed, the school was destroyed. She fled to her sister, and when she came back, her house was about the only one with walls still standing. And she ended up the first night, I think, with 27 people because she helped her neighbours, and they stayed in her house. There was no roof, but at least they had some some shelter. And she went on to tell the story. And as these farmers were talking about how serious it was, I could see that Archbishop Tutu, who's normally, sort of life and soul of any conversation, was becoming very depressed hearing this. I mean, he was taking it very seriously. So I decided to challenge these farmers, and in a light-hearted way. And I said, well, look, I grew up in Mayo in the west of Ireland. My father was a medical doctor. He was the only doctor around. So he used to have to go out on long calls to poor peasant homes. No fee, but we'd get chickens or poaching at Christmas, poaching being the illicit whiskey. But anyway, on these calls, my father would point out to me the way in which farmers would come together and help each other. It's called mehel, the spirit of mehel, which is an Irish word. And he'd point to the farmers in the field, and then he'd say to me, but of course, farmers will always complain. There's either too much rain, too much sun or something. So I challenged the 5 farmers. I said, is that what you're talking about? Farmers are never happy. They're always slightly complaining. It's always, not enough rain, too much rain, too hot, too cold, whatever. And it was Constance who stood up because she was saying something important. And she said, no, she said, and she looked at me. She said, no, this is outside our experience. And I thought to myself, what does she mean by that? What is outside our experience in a village in Africa? It's probably 200 years. Because you have grandparents who talk to a child, who'll talk to her grandchild, and so on. It's an experience like that is a long experience. And I've got to know Constance very well. She has become a very confident voice in climate discussions. And she was very present at a number of meetings and spoke out during the conference on climate in San Francisco in the last few days. Actually, 5 of those that I write stories about in the book were at the conference, which in itself was very good. Now, I would have expected that 2 of them would be there because they're much more kind of professionally involved, if I could put it that way. Christiana Figueres was the executive secretary of the UNFCCC, as it's called, the UN Convention, when we got the Paris Agreement. And she was central to getting the Paris Agreement and is now driving how to implement Paris in such a way that we do enough by 2020 in order to have a safe world by 2050. And so she has her mission 2020, and she's driving this and working with business and working with civil society, and we're on a B team together. And the other member of the B team, whom I would expect to meet at conferences, is Sharon Burrow, who's the most senior trade union woman in the world. She's head of the president of the ITUC, the International Trade Union Congress, based in Brussels, but attends all these conferences on behalf of all the federated unions in the world. And of course, they are very keen that there would be just transition from a world of coal, oil, gas to a renewable energy world with without totally sacrificing those who have worked in those industries, who have built the economies of countries, and who mustn't now be abandoned in a cruel way themselves because we have to move on to get away from fossil fuels. So she is an important voice, and there's a story of her and Ken Smith, a miner from Canada, and what he was doing practically to support just transition in the book. So I would have expected Christiana Figueres and Sharon Burrow to be there. I would have half expected, and it was nice to see her there, Natalie Isaacs. Natalie has a different kind of story because she was involved in the cosmetics business in Sydney in Australia. Middle-class woman. Her husband was working in the environment in some way and was kind of in her ear. And it was after she saw the film by Al Gore, the first film, An Inconvenient Truth. She said, I think I should maybe take this seriously. And she had a family. And so she said she would start to be more energy efficient in her home. Turn off lights, pull out plugs, use cooler water to wash, thing. And then the hardest thing was using public transport and not her car all the time and so on. And she found that she reduced by 10% and then by 20% her family budget. That was good. You know, it was actually good for her family because she was paying less for the electricity. And she said, you know, a kind of light bulb went off. And she said, well, if every woman, you know, in Australia did this, it might help Australia's not very good record on reducing carbon emissions. So she started a 1 million women project, hoping to get 1 million women, not necessarily all in Australia. I'm part of that 1 million women project now. And she thought it would be easy, and it wasn't. And that's an interesting part of her story. She almost gave up, in fact. And then she decided that she needed some support. She needed to get an app that people could use, because she said she was passionate. She had really made this a priority for her. But for many of those who were interested initially, it was a kind of add-on to a busy life. You know, I have so much other things on my mind, so many other things to care about. And so it was more difficult. Natalie has become very much involved with a group called WeCan, W-E-C-A-N, Women for Climate Justice. And they have wonderful meetings, not officially as part of the form of the conferences of climate that happen, or indeed of the California conference, but they get a very wide range of women together on the margins, if you like. But what is really good is the WeCan getting together of women has a wonderful cultural dimension, because they reach out to indigenous women of all kinds, and you know, there's a real sense of inclusiveness. And the other, what I would call grassroots woman that was there, in the sense, like Constance in California, was Hindu Umaru Ibrahim. Hindu has been at conferences. I think she was actually at a conference before me as an indigenous woman from Chad in Africa. And she's a pastoralist, and she talks passionately about Lake Chad, which was a huge lake that was a lake for not just Chad, but for Cameroon, for Niger, for Nigeria. And there are 10 million people who are in the surrounds of Lake Chad, and it has virtually disappeared. It's a very small lake now, and a very sad one. And she tells that story very, very well. She's very admirable. She's young. She's about 30. She has her own language, and I think even languages. French is her first foreign language, and she speaks perfect English. You know, so that's pretty good. She was, her mother said that she should go to school, and her mother was ostracized by the community for doing that. Girls should be at home helping their mother, not in school. But this helped her to become a voice, and I think she tells her story very well. I believe that this is how people will come to understand the injustice of climate change, the fact that it's unfair because it hurts the poorest countries and communities most. You remember the Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005. One of the stories, in fact the second story in the book, is about Sharon M Henshaw. She was a hairdresser in East Biloxi, and her salon was a popular place for women because it was a place where they chatted, etc. Her father had been in the civil rights movement. She was a woman of color, and you know, the heart and soul of her community. And then Katrina hit East Biloxi very badly, and all of their homes were destroyed. She had to leave and eventually ended up in a mobile home. When she came back, everything was destroyed. She rescued from her home an old table and some very faded photographs. That was it, you know. And I'm thinking about the storm hitting the Carolinas at the moment, and you know, there are people, especially poorer people and maybe people of color, who'll be that bit more affected. But she came to Copenhagen at the same time as Constance. They became what were called Climate Wise Women, and there was an organization helping them to come. And Constance christened her Mississippi Woman, and it was great to see the two of them, from very different perspectives, getting on well at Copenhagen. She had since had an illness, and it was relatively difficult to tell her story. And this is where Katrina was so invaluable to me, because I could find the people, I knew them, and I knew them from my work, etc., and I could tell their story like I'm telling it to you. But you cannot tell somebody's story unless you spent a lot of time with them. You've got to listen and really, tell the story well, if I could put it that way. And we sent the stories to each of the people whose stories were used in the book, and all of them were very happy. I think there were the most minor differences. Sharon Barrow actually sent a note back and said, "I cried." And Sharon is a tough cookie, as head of the trade union movement worldwide, if you like, as a woman. But she was very moved by her story and by the other stories in the book. And I suppose what I'd like to do is hear your views and questions. First of all, about climate change itself. When I was here with my memoir, there were some climate skeptics, if I could put it that way, and I got at least one question from a climate skeptic. If there are any, I'd be interested to hear from them, and we could debate that. But also climate justice and what are the responsibilities. Let me just tell you one more thing that I've done, which is also easy to access. I'm very passionate about getting the story out. As was mentioned, I am a very happy Irish grandmother. I have 6 grandchildren of our 3 young, and they range in age from 14 to 1 and a bit. Therefore, they will be in their 30s and 40s in 2050. They will share the world with about 9.5, 9.6 billion, they're calculating at the moment. We have a world at the moment of 7.6, 7.7 billion. It's a very big increase in a relatively short time, and I'm seeing the stresses on water, the stresses on land, the stresses on food production, the hurricanes, the pressures that we're under already. So I'm very concerned about that world and think about it a great deal, about that world and indeed future generations beyond it. So while the book was being written, I was trying to think, are there even other ways which I can try to message? And I was encouraged to think about a podcast. So I asked the question you ask when you're my age, what's a podcast? And this very good team came together to help me, and they found another Irish woman, Maeve Higgins, who's based in New York. And Maeve Higgins has done quite a lot of podcasts, and she's quite a well-known comedian. Now, when this was first suggested to me, I wasn't quite sure. I'm a former president, comedian. We've hit it off very, very well, and we are doing a series, and they seem to have caught a mood or something, because I heard a lot about it in California. Far more people knew about the podcast than knew about the book. But I just want to give you an indication of our approach in the podcast. What we say is, the podcast is Mothers of Invention. And we say, climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. And then well, for those who are kind of hesitant about this language, I also make it clear, man-made is generic. It includes women. And feminist does not exclude men. I mean, Justin Trudeau is openly a feminist Prime Minister of Canada, and men are more and more. What it means is we need a progressive, inclusive way of addressing climate, and that is the climate justice way. And we need to personalize it. We need all of us to do what we might do. And it will differ in accordance with things, but this is an intellectual organization. Many of you have the power to persuade and to use your writings, use your voice, use your circle that you network in to get more attention, because that is what concerns me. We have to make it an issue that people engage with as a priority, because we have lots of other problems, and I won't go into politics. No, goodness no, not even on climate. But this is the existential threat. I was on platforms with some scientists, Johann Rockström, for example, who's just taking over the Potsdam Institute in Germany, and he frightened the living daylights out of me. I mean, I'm already concerned, but he talked about being much closer to a tipping point than scientists had thought we would be at this stage. And it was very knowledgeable and very convincing. So what I would like to do now, because I always enjoy this much more than hearing myself talk, is engage you. So let's have a conversation about what I've been talking about, and I, in the course of that conversation, can elaborate more on the book or on the climate conference in California or anything else to do with climate. And if you're really stuck, maybe a question or two on Ireland, I don't mind. But
Hello?
okay, I saw some hands going up. Yeah. No, no, I think I'll leave you two to find the hands. Yep. Okay.
I have read in both the New York Times and The Economist that there are many scientists who say it is now too late, that we have gone past the tipping point. What is your take on that?
I don't think that's helpful. The worrying thing is that scientists are getting terribly, terribly serious. But if you want us to, be intelligent human beings, we have time. I've no doubt about that. We have enough time, but our children wouldn't have, or their children. The gap is closing, but things are happening. I mean, solar and wind and all kinds of energies are coming on stream that are clean and they're cheaper. And what I loved about the climate conference in California was that states like California, but other states as well, and cities here in the United States and all over the world were saying, we are moving much more rapidly. They're setting targets. We will be completely renewable energy by 2030 or by 2040. What we're trying to get everybody to do is not later than 2050, but they're actually being more ambitious because it's good for the cities and it's good for jobs. I mean, and that's what we need to see, that, that not only is it doable, but we can get there more quickly. And I need a pen so that I don't lose the... I forgot to bring a pen up. If somebody... Yeah, it just... Because sometimes questions, I have to take a note. Great. That's the second present you've given me. Okay. Yeah. Hello.
Hello. In terms of your interactions and your experiences, are you noticing any trends among the climate skeptics? So in terms of number, intensity of belief, or the arguments that are being made, what dynamics do you see at work as this discussion goes on?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it's difficult to give an overall answer, because actually there's an evangelical Christianity that I'm seeing in parts of Africa, and I've never known of denial in Africa, but now there's a little bit of almost denial for ideological reasons, and that's very unusual. I think one of my litmus tests is taxi drivers in Ireland. They were the most skeptical bunch, and I kept talking to them about climate change, and they wouldn't hear about it. Now they are completely convinced. They all want electric cars. They're moving in that direction. They're getting some sort of support from the Irish government, and they are, so that's an Irish thing. I remember a few years ago, two Kenyans coming into our office because they were part of a climate justice network in Africa. A Pan-African climate justice network. And Cecilia was the woman whom I got to know doing great work in Kenya. And the director of my office at the time was a former Irish civil servant with all the good qualities, knowing to ask the right questions. And he said, you're a Pan-African climate justice thing. Do you ever, what do you do with people who deny climate? And she came up with a wonderful answer. She said, she said, we don't have that problem. That's a first world problem, which I thought was a nice way of putting it. Even in this country, I honestly think there are relatively few genuine people that don't believe that human activity, emissions, are contributing to climate change. Of course, the climate is changing, we know that, but it's changing in a different way, and it's accelerating in heating, etc. And all the graphs and all they think show this. I think those who purport to are actually paid for or in the pocket of or influenced by or gaining short-term gain from the fossil fuel industry. It's like the tobacco industry, you know, it's actually very dangerous because it's short-term profits, and they know that it's damaging the future of our children and grandchildren.
Thank you for your. Thank you. I'm here.
There, good.
It's another woman who's short on one end. So it would be wonderful if we would all turn out our lights and turn off our water when we brush our teeth. But really, I think big changes need to be made on a policy level. And I think the basic thing that we all need to do, and you cannot escape politics, because if we could get young people who can vote, who are knowledgeable about this, to get out and vote for the people who are going to change policy, I think that's really what we need to do. And thank you for what you do.
I couldn't agree with you more, but the point is that if people start taking it seriously in their lives and in their behavior, in their families, then they'll start putting pressure. Because if they're taking it seriously, then what they're doing is acknowledging that we're not on course for a safe world. Sorry? No, I'm coming to that. But the point I'm making is that if people are taking it seriously in their lives, then they will go out and vote, because then it becomes the issue, the existential issue. And we need that pressure. I was very glad to see big marches in the street in California. Actually, Mayor Bloomberg, who was very much involved in the organizing with Governor Jerry Brown of the conference, expressed some irritation. He said, look, this is a climate conference. Why have we got marches of civil society? Why are they protesting? And some of us had to say, look, it's extraordinarily important that civil society are marching and protesting, because you're still not doing enough. You're better than others, but it's not enough. And that's attention that we need, and the more we have that pressure. But I couldn't agree with you more. It's policy. It's a carbon price. That would move the needle more quickly than anything else if we had a price on carbon all over the world. Ireland has a price on carbon. A number of countries do. California has a price on carbon, but it's not our carbon market system. But it's not enough. We're just drifting towards a situation that could get out of control.
Thank you very much. That was the perfect segue to my comment, which is that in addition to individual changes and voting and holding politicians accountable, some of us have concluded that we have to hold corporations accountable.
Yep.
They have such a major impact on the climate and on politics. So just to give an example, in Philadelphia, a few of us are part of a group called Earthquaker Action Team, which challenges corporations. We got PNC Bank to stop financing mountaintop removal coal mining, and now we're working to get PECO to make a major shift, our local utility, which is way behind, and to do it with a justice component. So I'm curious what you're seeing around the world and how you think about the role of that strategy.
No, thank you for that. That's a really important constituency, if I could put it that way. And there's good and bad. There are business leaders now who really are leading on committing to net zero greenhouse gas emissions in their corporations and in their supply chain by 2050 at the latest. Some of them are doing it by 2040 and doing it the climate justice way. It's a group, there's a whole group of We Mean Business, which was in Paris pressurizing for more policy, precisely, from governments, for more regulations, for doing the right thing. And the B team is kind of giving leadership within that We Mean Business, and they're linked to the elders. So I'm an honorary B team, and my friends Sharon Burrow and Christiana Figueres are members also of the B team. And we had a breakfast. They had lots of meetings, but I went to a breakfast of the task force of the B team on net zero, as it's called, the climate justice way. And actually we had new members, and some of them were pushing the B team to be more ambitious. Now, that's the good news, and the We Mean Business is good news. But unfortunately, there are a great many corporations around the world who haven't engaged in this way at all. And some corporations pay a kind of lip service that they will do the right thing, and they're members of associations that are busy lobbying the other way. So it's the associations that are a lot of the problems, and they have a lot of power, a lot of lobbying power. So what we're trying to do is out companies that try to say they're doing the right thing, but they're members of the wrong associations. But it is very important. And one of the companies that came to that breakfast is a fossil fuel company that has a lot of clean energy as well and wants to shift more quickly to totally clean energy for economic reasons. In other words, understands this is the future and wants help from others to make that transition as rapidly as possible, and that's good news. And the reason it's good news is that it has to be done the climate justice way. So it has to be done with regard to workers, pensioning off, retraining, reskilling, putting employment where coal mines were, all of that, which is really important.
So I just wanted to ask about, in terms of hurricanes, I've actually been through 3, but these low-lying cities who are at the edges of countries where we're continuing to rebuild and replenish after storm, which seems to be getting more and more frequent due to climate change, has there been any conversation about maybe the resources should be pulled back and some of these really low-lying areas should be abandoned and we should be devoting our dollars other places? I mean, it's not just here in the United States, but I'm just curious about, how many times is a country going to go in and rebuild, and especially if there's 3 hurricanes that come in one season or typhoons. I was just curious if there's been any chatter about that.
It's a very good question again, and I have to give kind of nuanced answers in the sense of the size of the problem. It's quite shocking. There was a conference on climate in the UN last year, which was about, in part, migration and climate displaced people. It was more about migration, but a lot of people will be displaced by climate change, precisely the ones you're talking about, where they can no longer live because of flooding, hurricane damage, etc. And the head of the IOM, the International Organization of Migration at the time, an American, said, and let us remember, there are 75 million people living in coastlines around the world less than 1 meter above sea level. And that's the scale of the problem. And then I was in Fiji in my envoy for the Secretary General before the Paris Agreement. I went to a meeting of small island states and of the Pacific Islands, and it really brought it home to me how vulnerable they are, because they don't have much space up. If you take Kiribati, it's small atolls and there is no high hill, so they're the most vulnerable. If we don't stay at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial standards, and we're already over 1%, then Kiribati is gone. As far as the president of Kiribati, he's in the book as well. He's, the former president, he tells that story. And in Fiji, I learned that there are 100 villages now where the people need to be moved because of sea level rise. They've managed 2. And it's been quite costly. People don't want to move. They want to be near the coast. They want to be where they are. They've buried people beside them, the bones of their ancestors. It's extremely difficult. And what we're not doing is thinking enough about precisely this problem. There is displacement already going on. I like to tell the story of a friend of mine. She's not in this book, but she has a very courageous story. Ursula Rakova is actually moving her small population of 1,500 people from a cataract island where they can no longer live because of sea level rise and saltwater erosion. And they're moving them to Papua New Guinea. It's not a new country. It's far away, but they're part of the same sovereign country. And she, a few years ago, was supported to buy land for them, brought over a number of them in small numbers to get to know their neighbours, And now they know their neighbours, and now they've started to move. And it's a slow process. You can't rush people in something like this, but at least, she's doing. And then she says it with such sadness, she says, but there's nothing I can do about the fact that we have to leave the land of the bones of our ancestors. And for an indigenous people, a spiritual people, that's really hard. And what I've been encouraging, and she knows it better than me, they're getting grandparents to tell grandchildren the stories, they're trying to weave as much of their culture into how they move. And we haven't given enough thought at all to that dimension of when people are going to be climate displaced. And there will be, a very significant number. I mean, you're perfectly right there. And this country, when a hurricane hits, has FEMA, has all the resources, has the volunteers that come out, and we've seen them in boats, just ordinary people. But there's a resilience. In many of these small island states, they don't have that same capacity, and even with resilience, I agree with you. We've got to be more intelligent about where people will resettle and make their lives again, not put them back into waiting for the next hurricane, which could wipe them out completely.
Hello. I just wanted to ask you, from your position, do you see a social sea change? I mean, a lot of people have been out protesting.
Mm-hmm.
QAT people, do you actually see that making any difference whatsoever? All the petitions, is there an actual change that you can see from your position, kind of worldwide?
I actually do think that when the then Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, had a climate summit in 2014, deliberately to work up pressure for a Paris Agreement, and 400,000 people came out into the street and marched. That had a huge impact on that climate summit and on pressure for a Paris Agreement which would be inclusive and fairer than it might otherwise have been. And I remember marching in that march with my fellow elder, Gro Harlem Brundtland. Gro Brundtland was the author, she's a former Prime Minister of Norway, and she's a fellow elder. So we were marching as elders, and people were gathering around us in that way. And she was the author of the Brundtland Report on sustainability, that we have to deal with this world so as to leave it in as good a state for our children as we inherited it. And that's the idea of sustainability. But we were walking along, and we were squeezed, literally arm in arm. We kind of held arm together, because otherwise we'd been squished in some other way, And I saw lots of climate justice banners, I was glad to say, in 2014 in the march. The march was led by indigenous peoples. They had pride of place, and a bit behind that were other groups, including the elders. And I saw coming in a side street, they were coming off side streets to join the main march, and off a side street came a group of women behind a banner that I would love to have joined, because it was Angry Grannies. And I thought, that's the one. As I say, the marches in California were big in San Francisco, and there was a continual pressure from the outside in, even though these were American states, cities, business, and international states, cities, business that were, showing more ambition. But the pressure for more was there, and I think that needs to be there because we're not doing enough. We're not on track, and there has been some slippage. And the Paris Agreement itself doesn't have a sort of big stick of enforcement. It was a very fair agreement, but it's kind of a weak agreement. And in fairness, politicians have tried. I mean, President Macron of France has had his One Planet Summit on the 12th of December 2017, 2 years after the Paris Agreement, to increase the ambition. He's having another One Planet Summit meeting during the UN General Assembly week, which I'll be back in New York for next week. And there's a lot of, there are those who are trying to give leadership, and they need almost the pressure behind them to help them to make that case. But the truth is, we still need more policy changes. And the biggest policy change that I'm told by economists would really move this needle is a proper tax on carbon. You know, that's the biggest one. Yeah, you've been trying for a long time, sir. Here in the front, he's discriminated against. You're in the front row and you're being discriminated against. But you better wait for the mic, no?
Very simply, are there any technologies in the horizon that carbon capture? You know, I'm not saying that might be the solution to the problem, but it might be part of the solution to the problem. The carbon capture, the technologies that are available, if any, or
yeah. There's a lot of discussion about trying to have technologies that capture carbon. Some of them are very much on the technological side, and Bill Gates is putting a lot of money into seeing if it's possible to have technologies that will help. But there's also a technology from the ground up, if I could put it that way, called drawdown and conservation agriculture, which is putting carbon back into the soil, which is reforestation, you know, all of that. And that's another big movement at the moment, and increasing. So, and maybe I should, you know, it's not exactly your question, but it's an important point, I think. I've learned, because I'm very linked to the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, which is a resource centre based out of London, but they have people all over, you know, here in the United States, but also all around the world, who deal with complaints of abuses by corporations across the board, just abuses by corporations. And what happens is they get a complaint. I'll give you an example. A small NGO in India goes into a manufacturing place, a sweatshop, and finds that there are all kinds of abuses of women there, their hours of work, not allowed to go to the toilet, all these kind of things. And they would file a complaint. And they would have found at that stage that there was a big manufacturing label that was receiving this up the supply chain. You know, I don't want to mention any names because this is a hypothetical. And then what the Business and Resource Centre would do is get in touch with the brand name and say, we understand that you, through indirect, but nonetheless it's your supply chain, get products, and these are the abuses that are happening. We won't post the complaint until we've given you 2 weeks, whatever it is, to answer. And then if you answer, we'll post both or whatever thing. And it's a very effective way of addressing. In the last few years, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre have had 112 serious complaints about large projects for clean energy, mega projects for clean energy, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, or whether it's hydro, that have no regard for land rights, for water rights, for consent of indigenous peoples. And actually, one of the people who's named in the book, but she's not a full story, but she could well be a full story, Agnes Lena, was with me in California. I mean, my foundation had helped to bring her to California because she's become one of these voices. And she's a pastoralist from Kenya, and has a women's pastoralist group, and is doing great work in her area. It also happens to be the area of the largest wind farm in Africa, 365 turbines. And when these were being put in, and before the last 5 or 6 turbines, the pastoralists realized that this was taking their land. And nobody kind of even thought pastoralists have land, because they were bringing their cattle over a lot of land, but it was their land, their water, etc. And they were not going to benefit at all from, because it was all going to be piped off to the big cities. And so they were lucky to find one of these legal aid lawyers who helped them to actually start a process in court. I think it is kind of settled now, but it actually halted the whole project. So it's a good example, because it's saying, A, you should respect human rights in putting in clean energy. We need the clean energy. We need it fast. But mega projects tend not to be suitable in a lot of circumstances. You know, if you've got a desert and you can put in solar panels, maybe. I mean, Morocco, I think, has done a good project there, I think. But and China has a good deal of space where it can do mega projects. But if you're if you have a population, I saw that problem in Honduras when I was there. In one place it was complaining about a solar project, in another it was complaining about a hydro project, and that was the one where the women were furious because the hydro project had knocked down some of the trees that benefited them, and they weren't getting any water, and it was actually drawing water away, and they were very angry about it. So part of climate justice is that climate action must also respect all the rights and the right to be informed and the right to be consulted of those affected, especially in indigenous communities. But at the same time, we need as many clean energy projects as possible. So it's a useful tension. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, it's kind of ironic, the fact that the rich, well, we have to define rich countries sometimes because it's the rich countries.
Can you indicate where you are? I can't.
Right here. Right here.
Ah, okay, thank you.
We have to redefine rich countries because, to be honest, the irony is the rich countries, and not all rich countries are created equal, are the developed countries are creating this pollution and this climate change, and the poor countries, which are the ones that are being affected, I'm guessing is because they're not developed or they don't have an action in terms of like what they're being abused by the rich countries. So I mean, not all in terms of per capita or how much money they make. There's a lot of countries that they don't have the emission. I'm not a scientist when it comes to knowing the future, but I've read a lot of articles saying that this could go from bad to really bad really quick from different scientific perspectives and factors. When it comes to justice, I think nature is going to have the last say. I don't know if I should press the panic button, and if it's going to be like apocalyptic prophet of doom, we're going to get destroyed by it, because I'm not God, and I don't know God's plans when it comes to religions. But when it comes to hope in your personal experience, in your life experience and resilience, do you think that love will find a way, that there is more to come for the human race, or are we bound to destroy ourselves because we're not taking radical action and changing these destructive patterns of behavior?
Well, that sounds like a good question for me to respond to as a way of finishing this wonderful conversation, because I know we're out of time. But I want to take it, first of all, the points you made about different countries. The thing that I really am very impressed by is the ambition of the least developed countries. There's a category in the UN system of least developed countries. There are 48. They include a number of the small island states, African countries, Nepal, Bangladesh, I was at their ministerial meeting before the last conference on climate. I was invited because of my Climate Justice Foundation and because I've been supportive. And it was a privilege to be there. Ministers from these countries, it was in Addis Ababa, because Ethiopia had the chair of the least developed countries. And what I came away with was being so impressed by the ambition of these countries. They want to develop, but they want to develop with clean energy. Now that's a change. That's kind of new. They don't want to go down the route of, and they know that they shouldn't go down that route. What they lack is investment, technology, skills, training, etc. And we're not yet at the stage where we see it in our solidarity and self-interest to encourage this wholesale and take the political will that's there and invest in and have. Now, there is a project for the Caribbean islands, I'm glad to say, after the terrible hurricanes that hit the Caribbean last year. There's a Caribbean, I've forgotten the word now, that's business people and governments and that coming together to make the Caribbean islands as clean energy as possible. And so that's the thing. And I just wanted to end with something that really affected me from my good friend Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It wasn't during our talk with the farmers. It was subsequent to that. But again, it was about certainly about 8 years ago maybe. We were in New York together on a panel in front of a social good conference. And these social good conferences are for young people who are on their social media. They're on their phones and iPads and things, and they're supposed to tweet. It creates a big buzz when you have these conferences. And so Archbishop Tutu and myself were on a panel with an American journalist. But when Tutu gets in front of an audience of young people. He begins to express his love, his belief in them. You're good, you're the future, I believe in you, and all this kind of thing. And the journalist said quite sharply, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist?" And he looked at her and he shook his head and he said, "Oh no, dearie, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And, given what he's done, the anti-apartheid movement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that he presided over, I saw him on live television crying during some of those sessions. They were so painful. And the fact that he knows you have to be a prisoner of hope. And it's absolutely right, because if you are, you don't see the glass necessarily as half full or more than half full, obviously, but there has to be something there to work with. And then you get active and you start to, what can I do? How do we change this? And it's at all levels. And obviously, it's at the policy level for governments, at the business level, to realize we're all part of the problem, every single one of us. I'm actually the worst in my foundation because I use paper. I have paperless young colleagues. And I also travel a lot, and my foundation has to offset my emissions in travel. So we're all part of the problem. Each of us would do well to think, what can we do? And can we be prisoners of hope? And can we actually use this short and shortening window for a safe world for our children and grandchildren? I think it makes sense, don't you? Thank you.